Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Jose Padin. He's the Vice President of Solutions Consulting for U.S. Public Sector at Zscaler. Jose, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to talk about zero trust. And zero trust, and you tell us, is still a really important imperative for federal agencies, even though it's maybe gotten knocked out of the conversation by AI in recent months. But it still is important, and why, and especially in the face of the threats that you're seeing against federal systems.
You know, what's really interesting, obviously around the Beltway we have our talking points. There's certain trends that are on. Zero trust was a trend, but zero trust is a very important strategy, and the growth in the use of zero trust in the federal government is a huge topic of real life applications that are going on. So, you know, when it comes to the different talking points that are out there, it is very relevant. It's very real, and it's used today, the principles of zero trust in our government agencies. And if we think about why that's the case, it's because if we were to grant people permission to get access to precious government data just because they happen to be in a location or happen to be on a network, that puts that data at risk, that puts our agencies at risk, that puts our country at risk. That logically doesn't make sense. If I invite someone over, they shouldn't have access to everything that I have in a network or everything that I have in a facility. They should only have access to what's needed at that point in time in the physical world. In the logical world, that's what zero trust principles provide. When someone happens to be on a network, it doesn't allow them access to everything on that network. If someone wants to access a resource that's needed, it's only granted for a permission at time to an authorized user at that point in time, and that's all. That's really the principle of zero trust. So yeah, there's a lot of marketing, or people will say certain things around marketing terms. It is a defined strategy today in 2025. We have multiple different frameworks that are out there, but they're all relatively the same. It's about making sure that people access the resources that they need at the point in time that they need them, when they're authorized to get access to them.
And that's really important in the threat environment now, since some recent research shows that it is data breaches of personal information and of login information, ID, that is the source of most of the data breaches. And therefore, even a trusted, quote unquote, set of credentials needs to be under zero trust.
Right. And you know, you're raising a great point. A lot of threat actors will look to get and harvest credentials. And the reason why that becomes so valuable is because if the only thing I need is a credential to get access to a network, and then once I'm on that network, I could get access to anything that's on there, then that's all I need is that factor to be able to get access to the network. Where we think it's important and different, and the way that the strategies are there today for zero trust and to have zero trust everywhere, is to make it so that just by the access of getting on the network or getting into, from a credential perspective, having that credential, that doesn't give you access to everything. So when we think about what should be available on a network, your crown jewels, your important data, the way that the agency does their business and the critical data that's involved should not really be on a lateral network that users can get access to. Mm-hmm. So if someone harvests a credential, got access to a network through a VPN, there really shouldn't be anything there that's accessible on that network. And by following zero trust principles, you can easily put up a boundary that is only permissible to the users that need access at a point in time that they need access, and it does not allow lateral movement across that network to that. And what's really important here, and I just want to highlight this point because I don't want to be too technical in this, but when it comes down,
yeah, folks listening are glad to hear it.
And right, and sometimes, and that's sometimes what happens with zero trust is, you know, we kind of get down into the weeds. But if we pull this up a level and think about this, why would you want someone to have unfettered access? That was the way that we did things in the 90s when we built our networks. We had a network, we had a user that came on, they went to a physical location, they got access to a resource that's on that network. Today, that's not the way that we would want to architect, because that application, that data could be anywhere. It could be in AWS, it could be on-prem, it could be wherever it happens to be. And by virtue of being on a network should not give you access to any of those crown jewels or any of that important data. And it's really a different way to think about it, but it's not a radical departure, and it doesn't take years to get. You can have wins in zero trust by using zero trust principles in the short term in order to protect your data and your applications. In fact, if you think about it from a Zscaler perspective, we went from just a few areas where people were using Zscaler in 2020 to 14 and 15 cabinet level agencies using zero trust principles in their agency today. Not something out in the future, not a 5-year program, not on evaluating frameworks, but are using the principles today to protect their agencies, their applications, and their data.
All right, well, tell us more about the Zscaler platform, how it helps people get to this state of zero trust, and how it helps them overcome some of the challenges they might find when they're doing so.
When we think about this from a high level, there's 3 core pieces to this. Our users need to be secured. So there's the traditional architecture where we would create VPNs and force people to hairpin back onto a TIC 2.2 infrastructure that's hosted on-prem in a federal government agency, and then from there go out to the internet. Mm-hmm. That really just logically doesn't make a lot of sense. And from a security perspective, if the person's going to the internet, why are we forcing them back on-prem to a physical location? So the modernization around that just makes a lot of sense. Let's take the user's traffic that's going to the internet and secure it in the internet. AWS is a pioneer when it comes to cloud. Zscaler is a pioneer when it comes to cloud security. If you're going to the internet, secure that traffic en route to the internet. So we take the traffic that's going to the internet, goes to Zscaler, we'll inspect it, we'll run our single scan multi-action against it. All of the things that you would get in big, expensive, on-prem security infrastructure, you get in the cloud, and then that path is secured out to the internet, allowing you to give secure access for your users.
It's almost like the hotel guests have had a shower and shave before they get to the hotel.
Right, exactly, right where you're going. And then when it comes to zero trust principles for access, when we think about how we would do that traditionally, we would then, okay, if you want access to this resource, get access to this network. And the lens of security was through the lens of network access. And there's a lot of controls, a lot of time that was put into that. But at the end of the day, that wasn't really the goal of what we were trying to do. We're trying to secure the applications and the data. But a lot of time is spent focusing on securing networks. So the change in that and what Zscaler allows you to do is focus on the real important part, and that's securing your applications and data. So by removing attack surface and allowing only authenticated access to even know where the crown jewels are located is a huge increase in your security posture and gives agencies a lot of protection in their applications and data. Mm-hmm. So that even if I knew the entire network schema, all the IPs, where everything was, the AWS locations, there is no path to access it. Literally, there isn't a way to access it because we've turned off any inbound network connections into the application and data. The only thing that's allowed are authenticated connections through the Zero Trust Exchange to the applications and data. That's it. There's no network path. It's only user or workload access at that point in time to the users, to the workload and applications that user or workload would need access to.
But that would also then have to encompass the network devices, which in a sense have applications running. They have source code, because you wouldn't want someone to bring the network itself down. If they can't get access to an application or a data that is mission critical, they might just want to do damage to the network itself. So zero trust extends beyond what you would normally think of as your applications and your data for mission and daily operational delivery.
Absolutely. And the way we think about it at Zscaler is zero trust everywhere. And we think of it through the lens of transformation and evolution. So the first critical area to focus on is your users, right? It's easier to transform that. It's simpler to move the users, take their traffic, send it to Zscaler, reduce your attack surface, allow zero trust access. Also, by the way, what you get when you do that is real performance monitoring of the applications and data for the users, not network performance, but actual application performance, what's happening. What is a known good behavior for that user? Is there a delta to that? There's alerting that you could do. There's all kinds of visibility you get into actual application performance when you do that first step. But the first step is, that's the biggest attack surface. I have all these applications, I have all this stuff accessible on the internet. People can, look for the attack surface, they can attack that. Let's remove that. Let's make sure that the users are getting secure access to the internet by sending them right in line to the cloud where they're going anyways. Secure that on that path. First step. Next step, workloads. Absolutely. So
users access and then workloads.
Yeah, users, access, workloads. That's the critical next step, to your point, because it's not just users that are on these networks, and it's not just users that are attack vector. So we want to use zero trust principles for our workloads, and that's the next step in the evolution of zero trust and path to zero trust for everywhere. And then when we think about it from a B2B or partner access, remote access, mission partner access, we want to be able to allow zero trust principles in those connections. So there's no right or wrong order, but from a transformation perspective, each agency needs to think about where is the biggest bang for their security buck and where can they get near-term wins. And along that path is what we tend to see from a transformation perspective.
And maybe just distinguish for us between resources that are applications and data and workloads. What's the difference?
Well, at the end of the day, it's relatively simple. If we break it down to this, if I'm a user and I'm typing into a browser, that's the user access. If there's an automated, maybe API-driven or more of a network protocol-driven access, then that would be what we would call a workload. So something autonomous, essentially something human for the user, something autonomous for the workloads.
And in working with agencies in those 14 or 15 cabinet level departments that you work with, what have been their challenges to actually getting through these points and getting to this transformation?
Well, I think that when we think about this, especially 5 years ago, kind of with a lot of the push, when as a result of the pandemic and looking at alternatives, it was looking everything through the lens of a traditional network architecture, right? So that was really the biggest challenges. If I only am really aware of the principles of designing things through the lens of network architecture, then this is a departure from that. So there's change management, there's evolution, there's things that go into that. If I only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If I only have a firewall, then everything looks like a network. Mm-hmm. So there's ways that I need to think about things that are different. So that evolution to understand that I don't have to design smaller and smaller networks and then protect smaller and smaller networks, that I can actually reduce attack surface, define only application level access, and then allow only authenticated application level access to that evolution, I think, is part of the biggest challenge. And sometimes you'd hear, well, we're thinking about zero trust, or we're evaluating frameworks, and we're going to decide. That's valid, that's important, and people need to understand. But at the end of the day, I read them all. All the frameworks are 95% the same, right? At the end of the day, it's what we're talking about here. Reduce, don't look at things as access through being on a network. Look at things through access for authenticated users only. And if we go through that path and come through that evolution, that helps expedite. And then, from another challenge that we commonly see is, kind of an order of operation or concern around authentication, right? And the heart of zero trust is authentication. You need to make sure that users can authenticate and that you can put that in effectively across the agency. So everyone has a one identity program, right? Every private company, every public agency, every government agency, I have a one identity program, right? And those one identity programs tend to have a long path on them. So if people think I'm going to get my identity fixed first, then I'm going to do zero trust, that evolution sometimes is a challenge that we work on to help understand. Most authentication directories that exist today can be leveraged for zero trust today. You don't have to wait until the end of a never-ending one identity program. You could start doing zero trust as soon as possible, get wins as soon as possible, and as the one identity programs evolve, and as changes are made there, it's already designed to be able to work seamlessly with those programs. So that's the one area, is especially if we think about today, over the last few years, just the increase in cyber attack has been, astronomical. So waiting, the cyber threat actors don't have to wait for programs, don't have to wait for approvals. They could use new technology, and they can see that attack surface soon as it becomes available, which is anything on the internet that has IP is being scanned and looked at. So a day zero vulnerability comes out. Those are, $1 million plus of vulnerabilities to be able to acquire and weaponize and use. But a day one is only a couple $100 for threat actors to get access to. So if you're not patching your perimeter immediately, and you're not going through a change management control that could take weeks or months to be able to do that patch, all of that time is time that those perimeters are weaponized. So think about reducing that attack surface as soon as possible, whether or not the identity program is finished, because you can increase your cybersecurity for that agency as soon as possible.
And just briefly, the AWS partnership that you have, how does that help leverage everyone into this world of zero trust in the contemporary architecture?
Yeah, and AWS is a great partner. We're very happy to work with AWS. AWS are pioneers and trailblazers in cloud infrastructure as a service. They really work to define the market. Zscaler is a pioneer and really trailblazed cloud security. So from a high level perspective, it's just a great corporate partnership, two pioneers in cloud working together. And if you think about the partnership, what we do to be able to help AWS is right within right within the AWS ecosystem. If there are workloads or if there are applications that are hosted within AWS, we make it simple to use zero trust principles to get access to that. So we make it simple and consistent for the user and the agency to be able to get access to it. So if I'm using zero trust principles on-prem, or even if I'm not, if they happen to be hosted, I simply add in the layer of our zero trust everywhere services into the AWS enclaves, and then I only create an outbound only connection for the users to get access to it. There's no inbound traffic that can penetrate or get access to those AWS enclaves, and it makes it easy and consistent for my users. Now, if I'm a user, I don't have to know, this is cloud hosted and I have to do something different, or I have to go to this different URL, or I have to authenticate a different way. I just simply type in the URL of the access that happens to be hosted in AWS, and I use zero trust principles to create access specifically at that point in time to authenticated users. So we make that simple, and then from a workloads perspective too, any workloads that are hosted there, we make it simple to be able to add in a layer of zero trust principles to create a zero trust anywhere mindset and allow you to create zero trust principles for connection to those workloads.
And I wanted to ask you about Doge, because among its initiatives is trying to find technological means, automation means, if you will, to increase efficiency for government operations. How can this whole complex of Zscaler, AWS, and the zero trust help meet that requirement of greater efficiency?
Right now, obviously, we're living in a time of change. Change is constant. And there are things to think about when we look at areas for efficiency, for operational efficiency, and ways for improvement. And when we think about using zero trust principles, there's a huge benefit to agencies, and many agencies have already reaped these rewards. So traditionally, we would buy a lot of firewalls, a lot of physical security, or outsource this to a TIC 2.2 service, and those are extremely expensive. There's a lot of time and energy that goes into O&M, hardware, actual capital cost, the management of that, and being able to make sure that these large infrastructures are up and running. In reality, a lot of times the question is, well, why do we need all of those physical devices to protect areas, especially over the last few years where people worked from home? There used to be applications in these environments, there used to be data, but a lot of times that moved out into AWS, into the cloud, into other data centers. So the traditional mindset that was used to create some of the traditional TIC architecture was correct at the time, but has evolved. Mm-hmm. So when we look at areas of efficiency, let's not send everyone back into the office and then invest in the same 90s architecture. Let's think about what we would do in 2025 and find areas of efficiency. So sending the security to the cloud where the user is going to on the internet and sending all of that traffic is much more efficient, a much better bang for your buck from an investment perspective, and gives agencies modern security that can expand to the needs that they need. So if the user is inside of the office or outside of the office or wherever it is, there's a bubble of protection that goes with them as they access resources on the internet. So it's a much more modern way to think about security, and it's a much more efficient way that can drive a lot of reduction in capital cost. And another thing to think about when we look at this is, often sometimes zero trust or different principles will be thought of, well, it's remote access. And the reason why the two have some similarities is because a lot of the zero trust principles that were put into action in the government were done at a time where there was an increase in remote users. But going back on-prem, there is a huge opportunity to be able to use zero trust principles there. And in fact, that's actually probably a bigger use case. Because if I have users coming into a network now, they're coming from the outside, they're in a hybrid work mode, they may be in or out, they're bringing all of the things with them back into a government agency facility. So I want to ensure that I'm using zero trust principles inside the agency so that when that device happens to walk into a physical location and happens to connect into a network, they can't get access to everything that's there. And that's really a core use case for zero trust principles. So the one thing that's important when we think about what's driving the efficiency that's going on today is to use zero trust principles to drive down cost and make efficient investments in infrastructure. If people worked from home successfully and we didn't put a whole giant stack of government firewalls in their house, then why would we send them at home and get a huge increased stack of government firewalls? Logically, it doesn't always make sense there. There's much more efficient ways to be able to allow that zero trust bubble with them when they're on-prem or at home.
Well, thank you for some really complete answers. Appreciate having you here today. Our guest has been Jose Padin. He's the Vice President of Solutions Consulting for U.S. Public Sector at Zscaler. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Accelerate Together, Zero Trust. For more on this series, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Zscaler.